Hey, welcome back. So, another aspect of the trip that I really liked is that it was a blending of so many different things, whether it was the natural, the urban, the surreal, the tragic, the comedic. All of these different elements came together, sometimes in the same moment. And um, so, I visited a whole bunch of national parks that I really was not expecting to visit. And I'm a big fan of the national park system. It's one of the few things. Libraries are the other main thing that I look at that you can point at and say, hey, this is government working. There's physical evidence of it. Um, so the national parks that I stopped at were Badlands and then Glacier and then Crater Lake and Sequoia and Death Valley, Hot Springs, and I think that's pretty much all of them. But they were really cool. My favorite by far was Glacier. Glacier up on the Canada border, and Death Valley is just a wild reminder of how much we take for granted and how vulnerable we are. Our fleshy balloon that we live in, how how vulnerable it is, how on the razor's edge our existence is. And if my car broke down, which it shouldn't have because it was a newer, low mileage car rental, but if it had broken down in Death Valley, that would have been pretty crazy exposure. It was like 116 degrees when I went through. Um, and yeah, a lot of these remote places, Death Valley being one, Fargo, North Dakota being another, were really surprising in their various aspects. Fargo was really cool because I'm a big fan of the movie and the TV shows, but I was expecting kind of like what you see in the show, minus the snow. I know that's a big part of it, but and it was a very hip area. It was a great downtown, good nightlife, good restaurants and breweries, and there was a dispensary, a lot of young people there. It was fun. I thought it was a really cool place. And um, so I was keeping in mind throughout this whole trip that I was passing through in August, and that even the bleakest place that I visited would be a hell of a lot more bleak in the dead of winter. And I was visiting an aunt who was telling me that she previously lived in North Dakota and was a school teacher. And there was one winter where including the wind chill, it was 90 below. Oh, I can't even fathom that. And they were thinking of canceling recess. I thought that was pretty funny that it was thinking, it wasn't like flat out canceled. She said, nope, we're going to have the kids dress up and then just basically like run to the flagpole at the end and come back in. I was like, damn, I like your style. um, so the remote places, the reservations that I went through, and the long road through the Dakotas and Montana, and then Death Valley and a lot of the southern travel was really, it got tiresome, but it was rewarding and thought provoking. And sometimes, eventually, I discovered I should start listening to some podcasts because I went through my long playlist, my 6 hour and 45-minute playlist, and I went through it about 3 times, and I was starting to get really bored. But I should mention that the podcast that I was listening to, I think you would find pretty interesting, and I recommend looking them up. So one of them is called Grounded by Louis Theroux, and he is a BBC gonzo journalist. I'm a big fan of gonzo journalism, and I sort of modeled aspects of this trip after gonzo journalism. If you don't know what that is, it's basically the style of journalism originated by Hunter S. Thompson, where the journalist is a part of the story. They are interacting and having conversations and kind of immersing themselves in various ways. I didn't embed myself with the Hells Angels or do crazy amounts of drugs or anything like that, but I really do like that sort of Vice style of journalism. And so Louis Theroux's podcast was great. One of his first episodes, he talks to kind of his doppelganger, which is John Ronson, another great gonzo journalist. And these guys have both stayed with everybody. They've stayed with Klansmen and the Aryan nations and black nationalists and the Westboro Baptist Church and UFO people and intense gamblers. And they've gone to prisons like San Quentin and Coalingo, where they keep the pedophiles before they try to figure out how to integrate pedophiles back into the general population. So really stuff that's kind of a bit um, out there, and that doesn't really make it into mainstream journalistic conversations. But the podcast was interesting. It kind of covers him, Louis, being stuck at home during COVID and what he's doing. And John Ronson was in that first episode, but I started listening to some of his content too, and he's got a great piece that he did for I think it wasn't NPR, but it was sort of like an NPR affiliate, where he talks about the podcast is called Alex in Wonderland, and it's about Alex Jones, because one of the people that John Ronson previously spent time with back in the 90s was Alex Jones, when he was really studying conspiracy theorists. And Alex Jones is a name that's been in the media a lot over the last couple years. And he was just getting his start and had just created InfoWars back in the 90s when Ronson met him. And the two of them tried to get into Bohemian Grove to discover what the Bilderberg group was doing. And this is this sort of like shadowy cabal of world controlling figures that's at the heart of a lot of conspiracy theories. And it's the Bohemian Grove is this summer camp in the woods in California, which I did not try to visit on my trip, but they effectively got in at the end. He and Alex Jones snuck into Bohemian Grove. It's quite funny, the recollection. He talks about it in his book, Them, Stories of the Other, or something like that. But that was a really interesting episode, Alex in Wonderland, where he talks about Alex Jones when he was a teenager and how he was conspired against because I guess he was a bully when he was a teenager, and he pissed a lot of people off, and they conspired against him and invited him to a party out in the woods. There wasn't actually a party, and they just effectively beat the shit out of him. And what he says is from that point, or what the story is from that point on, Alex sort of swore that he would focus on conspiracies because he was conspired against himself, or he started to take an interest in conspiracies. So there's another podcast of Ron Johnson's that I think you'll like too, called The Last Days of August, where he goes into the porn industry and talks about the death of August Ames, who is a young porn star who basically, I believe, hung herself a couple years ago. And he digs into the I'm not going to ruin it for you, but the podcast touches on some heavy stuff. It obviously touches on suicide, but it talks about mental illness, particularly in the porn industry. And it talks about he interviews all kinds of characters and acquaintances of August, and that's not her real name. It's like she's named after a car. It's not Ferrari, but it's something like that. But he talks with her boyfriend. He talks with other porn stars. Really gets, it's 7 or 8 episodes long, but really gets into it. And I thought that was fascinating. Now, another podcast that I discovered actually when I was near Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado was, and that's one that I forgot earlier to mention, is it's called G. And I think it was on the local NPR station. And I just heard a segment of it, and then it started to fade out. And I was like, oh no, that sounded really interesting. And it's called G, and this specific episode is called Unfit. And I guess it's a series that goes into intelligence. And I was super pumped about that because that is a topic that I've tried to delve into with various things that I've read and podcasts that I've put together, where I was reading The Bell Curve and then The Mismeasure of Man. And I am extremely skeptical of IQ tests, but I think intelligence is extremely important. And I think it does just like people have physical traits and physical abilities that vary on a vast scale, mental abilities as well. And I think intelligence differentiates, is very unique from knowledge, and that knowledge is just kind of like what you can cram into your head. Intelligence is like recall and how you can make connections, and your capacity for abstract thought, stuff like that. But this particular episode, Unfit, talks about the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, which I think a lot of people don't know about. But if you haven't heard about that before, it's the forced sterilization law that was put into effect back in the, I believe, 20s by the Supreme Court, when America, the United States, was very enthused by the concept of eugenics and actually really inspired Hitler and Nazi Germany to try eugenics programs. But it was Buck v. Bell was a Virginia law that allowed the uh, the sterilization of people who were deemed unfit. Who there were categories. These were previously medical categories of like imbecile, idiot, moron, and people who were deemed mentally inferior. They could be forced sterilized without knowing, and that is how it was used for a while. And even Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, his saying was like, 3 generations of imbecile are enough, or something like that. It's pretty dark. And it's important to listen to because this law is actually still on the books. It was never overturned. And the rationalization is like, oh, nobody's ever going to try to do anything about that moving forward. Nobody's ever going to try to use this again, but it actually is still used. And the guy who discovered this, he tried to call the local court around where he lived, and he said, oh, I have a daughter who has a form of mental retardation, and I'd just like to come in and get her sterilized. And the woman's like, oh yeah, no problem, you just fill out the forms. They should confirm, they should say that you're all right to have her sterilized. No problem. This happens all the time. It's kind of very spooky. And the notion is uh, it's no longer allowed for societal reasons, but it is allowed for the benefit of the individual that is being sterilized, which is like a super sketchy line. And it really makes you think. And it's important. I recommend listening to that one, and I'm going to try to listen to the rest of the series too. And maybe moving forward, I can actually have a conversation with them, because I thought that they did a great job. Um, Another podcast that was rather hit or miss actually was Scientology Fair Game, with Leah Remini and Mike Rinder, who are former Scientologists. Leah Remini was she played, I believe the name is Carrie. She was the character, the wife in what's the show, The King of Queens. Very funny. Leah Remini's great. And Mike Rinder, he is a really sharp guy. They're both really great. Sometimes in the earlier episodes, it can get kind of annoying because I think they're both excited, and Leah can talk over Mike sometimes. But overall, I thought it was compelling, and it talks about aspects of Scientology and how these people are stuck in a system, and and it gets into cult and why we can't help people in cult, and why people stick to the thing that has been bombarded into their heads, rather than trying to seek help or opportunity outside of the cult or group that they're trapped in. It reminded me, it overlapped with some of the conversations that I had at other points in the trip about narcissistic personality disorder, because it's a very similar situation where when somebody like a spouse has narcissistic personality disorder, the other person in the relationship, which is often a codependent person, is trapped under that person's tyranny. And it can almost be um, like a cult of one. So it can be very difficult to just like it's difficult to remove somebody from a cult, it can be very difficult to get somebody to recognize narcissistic personality disorder. And this is particularly relevant right now because the president, people don't like to, and you're not supposed to diagnose people without having met them. There's ethics to psychological diagnoses and medical diagnoses, and it goes back to the Supreme Court case. This is another great podcast of Legal Wars with Barry Goldwater, who is running in 1968, it could have been 64 actually. And psychologists were calling in and talking to magazines and calling him mentally ill. And there was a ruling of, okay, you can't say that if you've never actually met the guy. But I think it's pretty clear, and particularly based on the book, which I started reading over the trip when I picked it up in Seneca Falls, which is called Too Much and Never Enough. And it's written by Donald Trump's niece, that our president right now has narcissistic personality disorder. And by the way, she's a psychologist. So I think that's pretty important. But um, yeah, we need to open up the conversation about mental illness and how people's brains vary, and how the people that we choose as leaders, we can be misled by their superficial charm and what's the word? Um, yeah. Not charm, but charisma. That's what I'm looking for. So, by the way, that's an instance of where I've been told that I should have background music for when I'm trying to think of something, and you don't have the awkwardness of silence as I try to figure out my sentences. So, thank you, Dave. I will try to do that in future episodes. I hear you. um, but yeah, we need to have conversations about mental illness and things like narcissism and sociopathic disorder and borderline personality disorder, things like that. Because there are personality disorders, there are learning disabilities, there's intelligence differences between people, all these different things which are basically invisible, in which we kind of assume everybody is just dealing with the same thing under the hood, but we recognize the immense variation of the physical attributes of people. So we're not really there yet, but we need to have these conversations. And that relates to another thing, which I'm going to be getting to soon. So those are the main podcasts that I can think of off the top of my head. And there were definitely others. Oh, Yang Speaks. Really, really like Yang Speaks. And obviously I'm biased because I thought Andrew Yang had really great ideas to begin with, and I supported him for the 2020 election early on before he dropped out. But Yang Speaks, particularly, there's an episode where he talks with Scott Galloway about the future of colleges and universities, and this has been something that I've been thinking about for a while. And they phrase it greatly, where Scott says, are colleges and universities the new ghost malls? And I certainly think so. I think that's coming up in the next 5 years, where colleges and universities are going to start to shut down and look like the malls that you're seeing in your local towns, and the malls in rural areas, which are just abandoned, blighted buildings and former fixtures of communities. So college towns are going to be facing the same thing. So definitely check out Yang Speaks, and not just the Scott Galloway episode, but also the one with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, the one with Crystal Ball. There's the Joseph Gordon-Levitt one. He talks about time banking, which is a really interesting new idea, where we sort of have a secondary economy, not just based on money, like the primary economy is, but based on time, and how we can kind of donate our time and and be time compensated for that in various ways if we spend lots of time doing certain things that are helpful to society, right? And the goal is to not have it turn into the Chinese social credit system. But that's all I can think of for the podcast that I was listening to. And I'm sure that there are other ones, but I should mention the other aspects of this trip that I think are really compelling. And one of them was the memorials that I visited. So I saw a lot more than I was expecting to, and I just happened to be in the area. This sounds like I'm some sort of morbid tourist, and I do have a curiosity for things, experiencing them firsthand, but it wasn't intended. I wasn't saying, oh, I'm going to go and visit I don't glorify death or anything like that, but a couple of the memorials or sites of tragedy that I visited, I tried to visit Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho, I wanted to visit Waco, but that was too far south in Texas, and there's nothing really there. I visited the site of the Las Vegas shooting at the end of the Vegas Strip at the Mandalay Bay, down on the facility that was having the concert, the kind of fairgrounds. And I was looking through the chain link fence up at the Mandalay Bay. It's very creepy. And that's still really like, there's no motive to that yet that is known. I went to Columbine, which was really touching. The memorial that they have there, I thought was really phenomenal. I went to Aurora and I actually saw a movie in the Aurora Theater that 12 years ago, people were watching The Dark Knight Rises when that shooting happened. And I had been meaning to watch the Chris Nolan movie Tenet before COVID happened. It was originally due out in like July or August. So I went to go see Tenet. I thought it was a great movie, but I ironically was in I believe the same exact movie theater that they were watching The Dark Knight Rises in 12 years ago. And obviously they've redone it and everything, but it was an eerie feeling, and it makes you think. I could have been in that audience. Anybody could have been in that audience. It's just, there's a sad randomness to these mass shootings or these tragedies. So the next place that I visited was the Oklahoma City bombing memorial, the Murrah building. And that was actually inspired by the events of Ruby Ridge and Waco. And that was a beautiful memorial. Memorials, I'm a huge fan of. They really force you to think. And when they're done well, they blend lots of different elements and they do it seamlessly. So after that, I went to, I think I described, like I went to Dealey Plaza where JFK was assassinated, in the Lorraine Motel. I also went to Ground Zero on September 11th. I didn't go into the main plaza, but I was around it and I saw the buildings and I saw the police officers and the firemen and everybody. And it was reserved for the families. Justifiably, it makes sense the morning of, and then they open it up to the public later. But I was already on to other things. I saw where John Lennon was shot next to Central Park, Strawberry Fields, and like I said before, I saw the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was shot. And lastly, the last tragic site that I visited on this trip was Sandy Hook, which wasn't actually, that was totally random. I was headed up to the Berkshires through Western Connecticut, and I just happened to check, oh, I think Newtown, or I wonder where Newtown is. And it was within 6 miles. So I said, well, I better go over there. And that was pretty wild in the sense of, it's just, it's crazy to think that things like that happen. And there was no memorial. And I looked it up, and the memorial was just recently approved, maybe last year. And so they're going to be building it. But it shows how these memorials, they really take time to put together and to do them well, and how they blend different things, different ideas and quotes, and they try to put water, generally flowing water, and the masonry and everything that really in the foliage or trees. And they can be disliked or reviled if done wrong at the beginning. I'm thinking about, I also visited the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., and people really did not like that when it was first made. And it was actually made by a young Vietnamese woman. And I think she did a really good job at pulling a bunch of different elements together. And I think a lot of people have come around on it, but memorials, man, I'm a big fan. And I should mention, just as a side note, because I thought this was cool, is I visited the Watergate Hotel when I was in DC, and it is hideous. I cannot believe that is still there. I mean, I guess it's kind of maybe they should just keep a little piece of it and put a plaque there or something, because damn, it's like, if they're only keeping that around for historical reasons, which they probably aren't. I guess people actually live there or go there, but man, it's ugly. And ironically, it's right next to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. So you have like JFK and Nixon right next to each other. But I visited the parking garage, where Woodward and Bernstein, who broke the Watergate investigation in the Post, met Deep Throat, who was their informant in the parking garage, and he told them that the cover up went all the way up to Nixon. So that was really cool to go to that site. And I was taking photos of these places and posting about them. So I'm hoping that people noticed or had some appreciation, some historical appreciation or context. But I was mentioning earlier how there the conversation about mental illness, this relates to all of these sites of tragedy that I visited, because you know a lot of the focus is primarily on guns, and guns is an important part of it, but people miss the greater complexity of it. And the conversation that we're more fearful of than guns is mental illness, which is explains the person behind the gun, and what are their motivations and what got them to that point. And we need to talk about things like depression and bipolar disorder, and like I was saying before, personality disorders, and like schizophrenia and suicide and all these different elements. Like, are we prepared to go there? Because that's mental illness and guns are two things, but then there's also media, how the media covers these things. There's fame and our very sort of vapid sense of how we can get other people to look at us. And then there is, on top of all that, ideology and how people can be driven by what they believe to do things that they never otherwise would have done or would be very hard to justify in a moral sense. So all those things bleed together, and all of those things need to be discussed, and I'm hoping we can do that. So the last thing that I should talk about is the conversations that I had, and a couple conversations that I had, and also the more Americana pop culture things that I visited. So I'll start off with the pop cultural places. One of the first ones was I got off the exit of Berkeley, which I believe I had mentioned before was the first true brutal exposure to homelessness in its current manifestation with COVID. Underneath the Berkeley exit, which is across from Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area. And by the way, I visited San Francisco, or I visited Silicon Valley too. I went to Google, Facebook, and Apple. And so on one side of the bay, you have this immense wealth. And right across over at Berkeley, you have what looks like a refugee camp underneath the freeway exit. It's insane. The amount of trash and filth and the awful degree of hygiene and the public health crisis that is emerging with this homeless crisis is insane. So I tried to present images of that. But I went to Berkeley and I actually took a photo in front of Sproul Hall, which is where the campus free speech movement originated back during the Vietnam protest era, where people congregated and they protested the war and the various elements of the culture war took place. And I did a peace sign in front of the building, and I'm not sure that people necessarily picked up on that. I try to do sort of subtle, less on the nose documentation sometimes. um, Another place, the next place that I visited that I thought was pretty cool and culturally relevant, at least to me, was in Albuquerque, where most of Breaking Bad was shot. I One of the places that I wanted to visit, and a lot of people want to visit this that who are fans, are Walter White's house, which is a real house. A family lived in it uh, before, maybe some parts during filming and after filming. And there's a famous scene in Breaking Bad where Walter White, the main character, he goes home, he's got a pizza, and his wife Skylar turns him away, says, I don't want you. You're kicked out of the house. And he's upset, and he kind of flings the pizza in there, and the pizza comes out of the box and lands on the roof, and it's there for like weeks, and it's pretty funny. And so I guess a lot of fans come to this house and they try to throw a pizza on the roof or imitate that. And Vince Gilligan, the creator of the show, he has begged fans to stop doing that. And so I stopped by the night before after having read that, and I just wanted to see what it looked like. And it was like 9 o'clock, 9:30 at night that I got to Albuquerque. I was just going in front of the house, and they have a freaking fence in front of the driveway, like barricading. I felt so bad. Like these people are traumatized by pizza throwers, and so there's a fence covering the end of the driveway, and then the garage door is open with the light on inside the garage, and kind of the lights coming out, and somebody just sitting there in front of the garage in a lawn chair, like with their arms folded. I'm like, damn, these people are just on constant patrol for people that were just throwing stuff at their house or trying to take pictures. So I was determined not to be a part of that, and I tried to find an alternative place to take a photo, another recognizable location, and I ended up taking one at the dam where Jesse Pinkman, the other main character in the show, tries to disappear into the witness protection program, or the equivalent of that. And it's pretty recognizable, and the caption that I used was like "time to disappear" or something like that. But that was really cool, and I'm not sure that was people picked up on where that was. Another cool place that I visited was the Greater Wynwood Exotic Animal Park, south of Oklahoma City, in Wynwood, Oklahoma, which is where Tiger King took place, the Netflix show. So it's Joe Exotic's Animal Park. And that had been confiscated by the government. There are, at least there are signs that said that on the outside, and it said, do not try to go in or take pictures or mess with the cats. You will be shot if you try to do that. I said, okay, I'm not going to go and do that. I was taking some pictures on the outside, and it's cool to see the stuff from the show. It's also, I mean, it's already a depressing place based on what you see in the show, but then the fact that it's shut down, you could see the bears and tigers and mountain lions and lions kind of like anxiously just sort of pacing back and forth in their cages on the inside. I'm hoping, because apparently Carol Baskin was awarded the big cats for her rehabilitation center in Florida or wherever that is. I'm hoping those cats get there soon enough. But man, it's very rural, that animal park. It was cool to see, because and other people were showing up too, and they were asking me, and I'm like, where do we go? And I'm just kind of making it up for them. Oh yeah, go over there, there's a bear, and go over here. It's acting like I was a local or something. um, and then one of the last places that I visited with a pop cultural relevance, at least to me, was the I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast STown before, but it takes place down in rural Alabama. And basically there's a murder, and the guy contacts I think he's a dude from NPR, and says, hey, come down to my town. I have an interesting story for you. And he hates his town. He calls it a shit town. That's why the podcast is called STown. And I tried to go to the maze that the character creates. He's almost like, he's a brilliant guy, but he's brilliant in a way where he'll just like experiment with chemicals, and he's sort of like a no holds barred brilliant. He's not like I'm brilliant in a laboratory. uh so he designed a hedge maze with like 64 different solutions, and he talks about it in the podcast. And I tried to go there, but it was, I guess, since the podcast ended, the land was purchased by his enemy in the podcast, and I didn't want it. There was a no trespassing sign. I'm like, hell no, I am not trespassing in rural Alabama. I'm going to get shot. So I didn't go there, but I tried. And last thing that I'll say, oh, I keep having things pop into my head. The Nuclear Museum in Albuquerque, crazy cool. Check that out if you're ever in the area. Seriously awesome. You see the tower, a recreation of the tower that was used to drop the gadget during the first nuclear test in um, the desert in New Mexico. That was the Trinity test. And then you see the various iterations of the missiles, and a model of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you see some of the aircraft, and you find out just like the history of the nuclear program. And one of the more fascinating parts was was nuclear isotopes and various quackery related to medical products that were used, and claims that were made, like, you know, having a stone with nuclear material contained in it around your neck, and how people thought that was a good idea at the time, and also why the Nazis didn't get a nuclear bomb before the United States did. And I'm starting a book called Operation Paperclip about how the United States brought over all these former Nazis into our nuclear program, and are you know, sort of started to form the foundation of NASA, and that really meshed nicely with something that I was already interested in. So I thought that was cool. Um, and it talked about how Einstein was asked to write the letter to Roosevelt so that we would start a nuclear program, so that we would start the Manhattan Project before Hitler got his hands on a nuclear bomb. But long story short, the Nazis ended up getting involved in the V2 rocket program, and so they sort of discontinued. Not to mention, they sent some of their best physicists, because they were Jewish. They those physicists fled the country, so some of the best German physicists were just gone outright because of their fanatical Aryan supremacy. But the last part of this that I should mention, the last thing that I think you'll find interesting, is some of the conversations that I had. And one of the conversations, particularly, it was on the Indian reservation, in the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in the Dakotas. And the guy I was talking to, Arland, he was really kind, because I was trespassing on his property. I had gone through at the corner of the junkyard to take a picture of some of the junk. I had kind of crept through the barbed wire, and he comes over on his quad with his dog, and I say, "Hey, I'm just taking a picture. I'm not trying to steal anything or do anything nefarious." And I had a long conversation with him in the very oppressive Dakota sun, and he was telling me about his life. He's the grandson of homesteaders, and he's been there for a while. I was asking him about, you know, what his daily life is like. He was saying he goes to the store off the reservation. He was pretty annoyed that people had been taking all the toilet paper because of COVID. He was saying that the natives, you can't get them to eat buffalo anymore, because ever since that wasn't like the only option anymore with all the buffalo herds. They're just like, okay, screw that. I don't know how true that is, but I thought that was pretty funny. I asked him, because he lives on this native reservation. He's actually the descendant of, um, his family came from Norway, from Burgundy, Norway. And so I was saying, is there animosity between the natives and between the descendants of homesteaders? And he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, there always has been, there always will be." It was very matter of factly like that. Um, I should mention that Arlen is a really cool guy. I'm really glad that I got to talk with him. I took a photo of him too, but man, what a character. And he is just so isolated. And I'm visiting in August, and it's so bleak and empty and short, kind of scrub grass landscape. And I can't even imagine it in the winter. It's crazy. Compounds the bleakness. So I went to the store on the reservation to see what kind of food the natives had, and it's pretty sad. I've heard of food deserts before, but it really puts it right in front of you. It's, imagine the worst food from a 7-Eleven, and the freshest thing available to like a protein source, like a Lunchable, basically. So a food desert is basically lack of fresh food / nutritious food. And it was very apparent, not only why alcoholism is rampant, but also diabetes is rampant in native populations in the United States. So I'm hoping that that will get more attention, and food can be made more available in this era that we're moving into, which is going to have more plentiful opportunity to produce things that people need and also distribute it. So, another really, I'll talk about two other quick conversations that I had. One of them was in southern, I should say, Wyoming, and it was with teenage, probably 17-year-old girl who was working at the diner, and she was the waitress, and she had just gone back to school. It was her first day post COVID, or the first COVID return to school day. And I was asking her about her impressions about Wyoming, and she was saying, yeah, well, there's kind of a cultural divide between northern and southern. I say, what do you mean? She said, well, people come in from the coastal cities like San Francisco, places in California, and they come to like Jackson Hole, and they kind of like to sort of have that cowboy. They kind of like to see themselves as cowboy, but like part-time cowboy. So they're like, but the people in southern Wyoming kind of just see them as like city slickers. And I thought that was pretty entertaining to hear that, and made a lot of sense, because I totally know what she means, where there's like, you live in the city, there's a lot of people that like to have that like athleisure view of themselves, where the people that go to REI and they buy the outdoor stuff, and they don't actually do much of that stuff. They just kind of like the look of it. It's like buying Timberland boots that you never get dirty, or buying like the top notch truck that you never use for towing or anything like that, or any other number of things. But I thought it was pretty funny. And she was saying that when it comes to voting, they bring city, more cosmopolitan values. And I knew what she meant, in the sense of there's aspects of more rural culture that you want to preserve, and there can be an arrogance and an attitude of people coming in from the city, and the ignorance and arrogance flows both ways, of course. But for something like hunting, for example, if you grew up in the city and you didn't grow up around guns, then it's going to be seen as, oh, this is barbaric. And I think that a lot of people, unfortunately, have that attitude of, almost like the attitude of former frontiersmen when they were trying to like civilize frontiers people, when they're like, oh, they're savages, they're culturally backward, and they don't understand modernity, and we need to civilize them, or like ignore them, or just overwhelm them, or whatever. Like, that's kind of the attitude that a lot of people on the coast have towards people that live in more rural areas that they have never met before, have never interacted with, and don't understand. Like, the only sense that they have is from sort of like a stilted media perception. So that was an interesting conversation. Um, Also, conversation with a friend in San Francisco who was saying the emergent tech broiness of people in the young wealth of San Francisco, and what that's doing to the culture of the city, and how it's frustrating that it can kill off the sense of connectedness of the city, and how carelessness, and particularly too much wealth, almost so much that you don't know what to do with, and coupled with that talent and that sense of, I'm a god, and look, like that immense talent of being able to code and create wonderful things with technology, um, it really creates like a god complex with a lot of people. So that was an interesting conversation. The last one that I wanted to bring up was one that I had in Portland, and it was somebody who was saying how they I was asking them what they liked about Portland. And they said when they moved out to Portland, this person was saying that they were previously Bernie Sanders supporter. They were left wing, but really, um, they really felt screwed over by the Democratic National Convention, which is understandable in 2016, because the nomination was given to Hillary, and Bernie was kind of like pushed to the edge. And then in 2020, there was disappointment with Bernie not making it further too, and maybe some behind the scenes deals with that. But this person was saying how they like in Portland how they basically found the fringe, and that can be dark, in the sense of like it can almost sound like a slow move towards like terrorism, and that it can actually turn to that. But I believe what he was saying is you find different cultural elements and different ideas, rather than just sort of like mainstream ideas. I hope by fringe it wasn't meaning like, dark and prone to violence or something like that. But what he was referring to, and you outwardly said, was, anarchism. I believe, or I've discovered friends who are anarchists, and that was, I I understand it, and I see how people can come to this point where they're immensely frustrated and they feel like they can't, through the existing structures and institutions and political processes. And by the way, I entirely believe that a lot of our institutions are corrupt and need to change. But I do think that it doesn't need to resort to like utter destruction and chaos to get there. Um, but the pressure needs to be kept on. I agree. But the thing that was stated that I found, I guess, most disturbing was how, um, basically he was saying that, just I just can't stand liberals at this point. Like they're just all talk and no action. And I can totally understand what's meant by that, in the sense of there are a lot of people who are just kind of smooth talkers and they're glib, and they don't want any change that's going to affect them or anything that's going to be unpleasant. And I totally understand that. But I think that we need to keep the conversation open, and we need to maintain talking, because when the conversation ends, the only option left is violence and chaos. And so I disagree with that outlook. And I found it interesting how somebody who classifies themselves on the left and is, I guess, probably left-wing anarchist, it like puts a hard line between themselves and liberals, who are just people who are talkers by this person's definition. And so I think a lot of people are going through that right now. I'm not sure, or a lot of people are viewing things that way. I'm not sure how well they could articulate it, but a lot of people are just fed up. They're done with talking and they just want cathartic action. And damn, that's going to go dark places. So we need to watch out for that. We need to keep the conversation going despite those attitudes. Um, that's pretty much it. That's all I've got. And I know this was a long one. I will say that the MVPs of this trip, aside from my friends and relatives that took me in at various points and were extremely hospitable, and I thank them so much for that. The non-human MVPs of the trip were my Kia, my rental Kia, my tripod, which allowed me to take all kinds of photos that I otherwise wouldn't have. I actually recently inherited that from my grandfather, and I'm super glad that I said I was interested in that. Came in handy. Um, and then, of course, the Road Atlas, the National Geographic Road Atlas, that a couple years back I picked up an REI on an earlier road trip. And finally, Dude Wipes. I'm going to try to get Dude Wipes as a sponsor. I will promote your product all the time, Dude Wipes, because it's basically like a baby wipe for men that is biodegradable. And I use those all the time. I defecated many times in cornfields and random places, and it was nice to have something that wasn't like one of those restroom brown paper towels that will make you bleed if it touches any part of your body. um, so, Dude Wipes, use them. Check those out. They're awesome. And with that, that's all I got. With these 3 episodes, that pretty much encompasses the trip. And I'm planning to have more conversations about other parts of this with in future episodes. And if you have any questions, let me know in the usual places. Send me a message, or DM, or through, I don't know, email or podcast website, whatever. Later, everyone.